So would you please now join me in warmly welcoming the Director of Research from the Demographic Group, Simon Kuschenmacher.
Thank you so much for the lovely warm welcome. Yes, I'm a demographer. That means all I do every day, all day long, is look at big fat data sets and trying to make sense of them. Trying to understand how Australia changes, how Victoria changes, how certain industries, certain sectors, foster care in this instance, will change or has been changing over the last couple of years. And as a demographer, I'm legally required to show you a population chart. So, ta-da, here it is. It couldn't be a more simple graphic. You have babies on the left, 100-year-old folks on the right-hand side. This is the Victorian population as of right now, 6.7 million people or thereabouts. But that's the status quo. Who cares? That's boring, isn't it? It is much more exciting to look ahead, to understand what Victoria will look like in, let's say, 10 years. And only forecasting the population by 10 years is, as long as there isn't a pandemic throwing a spanner in the works, is a ridiculously simple task. Because we have such a clear understanding of how many babies you will be making this year. We really know how many of you won't be making it until next year. And as a nation, we are dictating the migration intake. So we'll be pretty spot on. There's a bit of a question, how many people will move to New South Wales, how many will move to Victoria and so forth, but more or less our forecast will be spot on. First observation, top right-hand corner, we will be adding 1.2 million people. That's a weird number. It is exactly one Adelaide that we will be adding to Victoria. We've been doing this for quite a few decades now, and this is the kind of rate of growth that we are being used to. And that creates quite a few challenges, this population growth, but we'll also see why this is actually needed. You also see that this growth that will come at us, that's not evenly distributed across the whole age spectrum. The number of kids, 0 to 14-year-olds, that is only increasing by a little bit. Not all that much growth. Massive growth, however, in the young adult market, 15 to 25-year-olds, the sex, drugs and rock and roll phase of the life cycle, that sees lots of growth. So if you invested into those industries, good on you. Not so much growth in the 30s. That's simply because at the moment we have this gigantic millennial generation sitting in their 30s and they move out of this into the 40s. And therefore we end up with 43 coincidentally being the single year of age that will see most growth in the coming decades. That is, statistically speaking, a nice alignment, because at 43 you spend more money than ever before or ever after in your life. Makes sense, doesn't it? At 43 you had a couple of promotions, so your income tends to be nice and high. You also have big costs, because you have 1.7 kids at home, they eat a lot of Weet-Bix, they need school uniforms, cricket bats, the costs don't stop, plus you have a big fat mortgage. At 43, every penny that you earn goes straight out the door. Terrible news for you if you're 43, but it is great news for the Victorian economy. We just happen to go through the post-pandemic economic recovery phase as the biggest generation ever reaches the highest spending phase of the life cycle. That's demographic dumb luck for you. We didn't do anything to deserve it, but we'll take it. The big issue, of course, and you read this a million times, is that we are aging. It doesn't come as a surprise. You read this so often. But I think we're not quite clear about the severity of how much we're aging. The year of age that I'm really concerned about is always 85. Because 85 is also the median age of death. That means half of you, it's that half, you won't be making it to 85. Sorry. The lucky 50% over here, half of you guys, that's the front half, you will need assistance with activities of daily life. You will need care. It is definitely expensive to grow old as a country, as a state, but it is outrageously labor intensive. We are going to double the 85 plus cohort in Victoria in the next 15 years, if not 14 years. So that means, where the hell do we get those carers from? That alone guarantees, because if you've ever been to an aged care facility, you know that these carers do not come from Australia. we import cheap care work from overseas. We will continue to do this. The high migration approach that we are following is very much baked into the system. Simply because the skill shortage that you're experiencing right now, if you tried to hire somebody in the last 3 years, that wasn't fun. And part of this was a COVID impact because we, essentially the federal government told young workers, international students, temporary visa holders very early on in the pandemic that no financial assistance was going to be extended to them, so they buggered off. And that created a bit of a dip in the workforce, obviously. That made the skills shortage worse. But we would have a skills shortage either way. Simply because the skills shortage is baked into the demographic pie and it will not get better in the coming decade, even under a high migration scenario. Simply because we have this big fat baby boomer generation on the right-hand side leaving the world of work over the next decade. They are, of course, allowed to retire because they worked so many years. Retirement is not a new phenomenon either. But this time around, we have a big generation leaving the world of work. In the past, when this happened, you had a larger generation enter the world of work at the other end. This time it is big cohort out, smaller cohort in. That's an imbalance. Because a big chunk of those people in their 20s, they're not here permanently. These are international students. They might be doing the occasional hospitality or retail job, but ultimately we cannot count on them to amp up the workforce at scale. So big generation out, smaller generation in, as if this wasn't bad enough. We have the millennials, the big fat millennial generation, continuing to make babies for the next 13, 14 years. That means they at least leave the world of work temporarily. The skills shortage is here to stay. And that has severe implications for absolutely everything. And we'll be diving into this a bit more. But we also shifted during the pandemic, we shifted the geography. And that's important if you want to locate where you might have need for foster care, where you might find potential foster carers, because we have been shuffling around our population. Early on, this is a bit of a post-traumatic stress inducing map here, because these are the COVID times. This map shows the population change in Greater Melbourne from June 2020. So almost no pandemic impact, to June 2021, full-on pandemic impact. And you see that the inner city bled population like crazy. This is international students and temporary visa holders leaving the country. This is, of course, also young people from interstate not moving into the city, which they would have usually done. Also, quite a few people that lived in the inner city that were willing to pay a premium to live close to their work, to avoid the soul-destroying commute. After a couple of months of working from home, they figured out, wait a second, I pay a premium to live close to the office tower that I'm not going to. How about I don't do that? How about I find a cheaper house on the urban fringe? So we've seen this movement to the urban fringe. Well, fair enough. That's the pandemic. A year on, June 2021 to June 2022, we've seen a bit of this shift. We've seen, well, there was less population to leave, so there's still a bit of population loss in the middle suburbs. The inner city kind of almost recovered. But why are we still talking about this? Isn't the pandemic over, knock on wood, for all intents and purposes? Well, we don't care about the pandemic because the exact same population pattern would have occurred even without COVID, simply because it is demographic in nature. What we are seeing here is the exodus of millennials that live in the inner city, hipster suburbs of Fitzroy and Brunswick, already coupled up. As soon as they make babies, 1.7 babies each per household, they need a larger house. They need a 3, they need a 4-bedroom dwelling. Those dwellings aren't available, let alone affordable in the inner suburbs, so they can't stay in the inner suburbs. They have to move. And that's what their baby boomer parents have done when they made babies in their early 20s back in the day. They moved to the middle suburbs though. Millennials can't do this because their own beloved baby boomer parents are hogging the 3 and 4 bedroom homes in the middle suburbs. They are great NIMBYs. They block development as much as they can. So millennials have to jump ship. they have to move to the urban fringe, they have to move to the regional capitals of your Geelongs, your Bendigos, whatever. That will continue for the next 13, 14 years. We'll have the big millennial generation jump the middle suburbs into the urban fringe, into regional Victoria. That's where the young kids will be found. That's guaranteed, that's baked into the demographic pie. The young people from overseas that come in, the young people from interstate, they move into the exact same suburbs that they always have, they move into the center of town. The geography of Victoria is outrageously predictable over the next 10 years. I'm telling you this in case you still want to, pick and choose where to advertise or where to hunt for people, so to speak. The way that we live our lives significantly changed, and it really impacts, it's one of the reasons why we see fewer foster carers. So before we arrive at how we live our lives today, though, we got to move back to simpler times. Let's go back 80 years to the 1940s when life was simple. You were a kid, and then from one day to the next you became an adult. You followed your dads into the mines, onto the fields. You became an adult. You worked really hard for your whole life until your back gave in and you really couldn't work anymore. And then at 65, you finally were allowed to retire. Unfortunately, you died 2 years before that. So, on the upside, that made the pension scheme easy to finance. Let's move on 40 years from that into the 1980s. This is when, thanks to the baby boomers, and thank you very much for that, we found a new stage of the life cycle, the teenage years. And that is of course, the carefree sex, drugs and rock and roll phase of the life cycle. Good fun, but it was actually a fairly narrow stage of the life cycle. Baby boomers started families in their early to mid-20s after a bit of, LSD-infused, self-exploration and whatever. But then they had very boring, very predictable family lives, and when they got to retire at 65, they actually got to enjoy a decade worth of retirement. The pension scheme was still reasonably easy to finance in this environment, for example. What does the world in Australia look like today? What kind of lives are we living? Well, the first observation is that we added a new stage to the life cycle, adolescence. That is a phase that begins when you're 13 and it ends in your mid-30s. And that has to do with my favorite definition of adulthood. You become an adult when you take responsibility for somebody other than yourself. That makes sense. Young people don't go to the military where they're being forced to literally look after the lives of their fellow soldiers. We don't start making babies until our mid to late 30s, if at all. So we can very much afford to be adults, grown-up people, grown-up couples, dual income households without any real responsibilities. This is why all those stereotypes about millennials being these snowflakes, the carefree generation, where this kind of stuff comes from. You are not choosing to grow up, you're being forced to grow up, to become an adult. People are very, very capable of growing up whenever they need to. If you don't need to, you don't grow up. What this means in practice from a foster care perspective is we live longer lives. And as we live longer lives, we live slower lives. We hang out in each stage of the life cycle for longer. So we draw out childhood, we draw out this adolescence phase as much as we can and as much as we need to, until we really have to take responsibility. So that means, if you simply look at the population that you can target as foster carers, I think the younger cohorts are increasingly out of reach. How do you force them to grow up? You only take foster care responsibilities on when you are fully ready to do this, when you choose to do this. And my theory is that you don't tend to choose to become an adult. It gets thrown at you. And fewer people find themselves into this stage, and that is not working in favor of the foster care system. Couple of opportunities, however, are emerging in the life stages as well. So it's not all doom and gloom here. If you played your cards right, if everything worked your way, financially speaking, you get to reach the beautiful stage called the lifestyle stage of the life cycle. That is the phase of the life cycle when you decide how much you work. Maybe you go down to 4 days, 3 days of work. Maybe you just take really long holidays in the middle of the year, go on a Rhine River cruise in Germany. All these kind of fun experiences, because you don't need to work for the money, you work for a passion, you work for desire. And from a marketing perspective, this cohort is a dream come true because they are rich in time and money. All other cohorts lack one of the two. Those guys have it all. So that's a great cohort to be targeting potentially if you find a way of allowing them to foster on their terms. That is a growth cohort, but we'll see about a couple of other issues there. Of course, financing 20 years worth of retirement for each and every human in this country is a bit of a challenge. Superannuation makes this kind of possible, but that is a discussion for a different day. We have more to talk about here in terms of major societal shifts that are impacting foster care. And to do so, I want to take you back to my favorite day of the year. Comes around every 5 years actually only, and that is of course Census Day. So if you remember this most magical of nights, you were kindly asked to put your job into the little form. You typed it in, and our friends at the ABS, they took your answer for whatever it was and they put it into one of 1,300 categories. That's the number of jobs that officially exist in Australia. Every single one of those jobs has a number from 1 to 5 attached to it. That's the so-called skill level. That indicates how much formal education is required for you to do the job. Skill level 1 jobs, they require a university degree, doctors, engineers. Skill level 3 jobs, they require a TAFE level degree. All the tradies sit in this. That's the entry ticket to the Australian middle class, so to speak. Skill level 4 jobs are called low-skill jobs. Some sort of formal education is needed, maybe a driver's license to be a truckie. Skill level 5 jobs are so-called unskilled jobs, no formal education needed. All you need to know for the job, you will be taught on the job. Retail and hospitality jobs, for example, quite often fall into this category. The single best indicator for your income in this country is your level of education. The more highly educated you are, the more money you make, period. It's just that simple. And yes, I know that you all know of a plumber, don't you? A plumber who takes home $300,000. And it's true, he's real and he's a he because 99.99% of plumbers are in fact men. It is the most male job in this country. He's cheating because he's not actually a plumber. He's a small business. He has an office staff and he has 2 apprentices and another plumber working for him. And he takes a couple of cash jobs. That's how he gets to $300,000. Just wanted to get the plumber question out of the way because it always comes up. So education is king. The more educated, the more money you make. The Australian workforce in the 1980s, or that's actually Victorian workforce, in the 1980s, 23% of jobs required a university level education. Baby boomers who held those jobs got a free university degree. That pay a premium that the university degree guaranteed was really nice and high. The backbone of the middle class, skill level 3 jobs at 19% already shrank down quite a bit from the heights of the 60s when it was actually the biggest cohort of jobs. Let's bunch together skill level 4 and 5 jobs into a single category. They make up 48% of the workforce. And I'm bunching them together, skill level 4 and 5, because there is no way in hell that a skill level 4 and 5 worker now or ever into the future can afford a house in Melbourne. It's out of the question, will not happen ever again. So that means we want to see these skill level 4 and 5 jobs killed off as much as possible. And we kill the jobs, not the workers, so it's perfectly ethical. So let's have a look at the development of the Victorian workforce over the last 3.5 decades or so. First observation, we well and truly transitioned into a knowledge economy. Well over a third, 37% of all jobs require a university level education. That is huge. over half, it's 51% of 29-year-olds have a job that requires a university level education. We are truly transitioning into a knowledge economy. The backbone of the Australian middle class, skill level 3, that just shrank away to a mere 12%. The Australian middle class kind of stopped existing. That is terrible news from a perspective of social glue. Who's providing social glue in this country? It's not the middle class. It's not religion. We have over 42% in Victoria who say they have no religious affiliation whatsoever. The remaining religious people are split across ever more diverse number of faiths. Religion is not working as social glue. That means the last remaining bastion to provide social glue is sports and a couple of community organizations. That's quite the burden to shoulder. And you've seen how hungry the nation was for the Matildas to succeed. We need this as a country. It's quite a severe desire. You know, no pressure on the teenagers right now that are exercising to become the Olympic gold medalists of the 32 Olympics in Brisbane. But hey, you know, pressure's on. We need this. Good news is we killed off enough skill level 4 and 5 workers. That's helpful. We want automation to kill as many of those jobs as possible because they are expensive. Yes, you get cheap food delivered, congratulations. But you need to pay for this food later on because people on skill level 4 and 5 incomes, they do not put enough money into their super and they need to be subsidized through the pension scheme. Having skill level 4 and 5 workers retire is extremely expensive for the country. And so we want to avoid this. What does this mean? Well, it means that in this rising cost of living environment, the lower down the pecking order you are here, the more stressed you are financially. If you are up on the pack there, you might be annoyed by the interest rate rise yesterday. Yeah, that's a bit of terrible news, but on the bottom, this is existential news. So the bottom third, 40%, 50% of society gets absolutely hammered at the moment. It is always the most vulnerable people who get hit the hardest in the current environment. That's not changing. This is slightly depressing news, but well, is there an opportunity potentially? They say, well, there are more people with high incomes. Surely they can pick up the slack. They can take on all the caring responsibilities. We just shift this a bit. Can't be that hard. Well, let's think this through a bit because there are a couple of other societal shifts that occurred. This chart shows the workforce participation rate of women. And we go back to the 1980s when women joined the workforce when they were young. They then had kids fairly early on in their 20s. They dropped out of the workforce for quite a while because they had 2.5 kids. Then they dropped back into the workforce and they then transitioned out of the workforce rather quickly. Let's move on. 20 years, you see the same shape, the same pattern occur. But kids a bit later in life, you drop out not nearly at the same rate. The curve doesn't go down nearly as steep, and you then stay in the workforce for much longer before you drop off. 20 years on, you almost don't drop out of the workforce again, and you return to work at record high capacity, at record speed, and you really work extremely long. You don't drop off out of the workforce anytime soon. I have 3 more years of data, pandemic-induced cost of living pressures. You can't squeeze more work out of the female workforce. Maybe there's a bit more of longer working hours, but there isn't much more to give. That is about it. All of those millennial households are dual income households. If they're mortgage holders, you can be dead certain that they will be dual income households just to keep up with those pressures. Well, that means, do you have enough time to take on care responsibilities if financially speaking you have absolutely no wiggle room whatsoever? Probably not. So that is a tightening of the pool that is occurring there. Well, just to lift the mood occasionally, there are a couple of things that put a bit of a optimistic spirit into my soul, so to speak. And this is the volunteering life cycle. This is the share of the population here by age that volunteers. And there are 3 distinct peaks of volunteering in your life. The first one is in your teenage years when your school forces you to volunteer. And the second peak is in your 40s when your kids' school forces you to volunteer. And then the third peak of volunteering is just after you're retired, when you actually want to volunteer. And the wonderful news is that this population growth that I've shown you on the first chart perfectly aligns with the volunteering peaks. We at least theoretically have the highest alignment that we ever had with volunteering and population growth. So you have at least a fighting chance to get, the volunteering sector amped up. That again assumes that we ask nicely and that those people find a bit of room in their calendar, in their financially pressured environment to actually do the work. But that is a ray of hope. I think that doesn't put me into all that optimistic of a mood is unpaid care. This is the number of people, the share of the population by age that provide unpaid care. This essentially means that you look for either a disabled child, but mostly it is you look after your parents, after elderly parents. And that is, of course, in your 50s when your parents are about 30 years older and they're in their 80s. Right now, we have a super small cohort, the Gen Xers in their 50s, so the unpaid care isn't all that big, even though the cohort of the elderly people is actually nice and strong. So that's not great news. So the care pressure, so we can't put all that many care responsibilities onto the unpaid care workforce. That means it needs to be professionalized. That means that eats into the limited workforce or labor pool. So that's a further tightening of the system. The system is at maximum stretch, so to speak. Not an easy environment to find carers in. We'll talk about a couple of care personas in a bit, but now I want to talk you through the Australian or the Victorian population by generation, and we completely ignore all the generations that are not potential foster carers at the moment. So the pre-boomers, who cares about them? People born before the end of the Second World War. Who cares about Gen X? People born in the 18 years of this millennium, and the babies of today, who cares about them? We only look at boomers, Gen X, Gen Y. Baby boomers born in the 18 years following the end of the Second World War were the biggest birth cohort that we ever had. Birth rates of 3.5 women per child. That was really big. And a special generation, big generation. They had it well, economically speaking. Economic tailwinds all the way. They revolutionized every stage of the life cycle that they ever touched. That's important, and that's a potential opportunity, because in the next 10 years, even the youngest baby boomer will be officially of retirement age. They will enter a completely new stage of the life cycle. That doesn't mean that all baby boomers will be retired. Some of them will still hang around on your company boards. They will still have talkback radio shows. But more than anything, the social cultural influence of baby boomers is changing. They won't be working. They can't reinvent themselves. Take them on the journey to reinventing themselves. If they're in their 60s, maybe even their 70s, they could be potential foster carers if you speak to them the correct way. So let's understand this cohort a bit more. I think they're quite often miscategorized as a purely materialistic generation. You want to understand who raised them. Their parents saw the First World War. They saw the Second World War. And for good measure, in the middle, we threw in the Great Depression. So no wonder that the baby boomers measure their success in life against a bit of a materialistic yardstick. And they had it well. The economic tailwind was great. They invented the way we work. Women entered the workforce at scale for the first time in history. Australian households went from 1 to 1.5 household incomes. That changed the world forever. This additional money turbocharge the spending capacity. This is when our consumer culture really exploded, so to speak. This money was initially spent on labor-saving devices, vacuum cleaners, fridges, washing machines, and it was spent on cars. And that changed Australia forever, because even modest families could afford some sort of car. And before baby boomers came along, our cities were rather condensed. We didn't have those sprawled out cities today, as we have today. But then you could afford a car, so you drove out until you could afford a quarter-acre block. You built a brick veneer. If you were Greek, you put up a couple of columns. Life was well. The next family drove 5 meters further, did the same thing. Next family, another 5 meters. Multiply this times a couple of decades, and you have really big sprawled out cities. You have many car-dependent suburbs where you're isolated without a car, and so forth. So that changed the way we did operate. When you want to reach baby boomers, you want to think about what they tell themselves about themselves. So they are a very highly value-oriented generation. When you talk to them from a marketing perspective, values, narratives, that works really well. You can be even quite a bit moralistic with baby boomers. They were a generation that worked themselves to death. They were happy to forego family time in order to increase family income. Is there a bit of a redemption narrative that could work with them? Potentially, who knows? They have 60% of all the cash savings in this country at the moment. They are extremely asset rich. They have all the spare bedrooms in Australia. They are an opportunity. They are a cohort. If you touch them, if you reach them, that's a potential great asset. But they're handing over the power. By now already we're handing the power over to the small, forgotten, poor underdog of a generation that is Gen X. Born in the 60s and 70s, Gen X is the quintessential forgotten generation because they're sandwiched between two big generations, and so they were just always skipped when we talk about generations. That was okay in the past, but that's a mistake we can't make in this decade, because there is a level of seniority baked into leadership in this country. You become Prime Minister at 54, you become CEO at 52. This is the time frame that Gen X finds themselves in. Even though they are an underdog of a generation, they are now in all the top leadership positions. Every state premier is a Gen Xer. Let's quickly recap why Gen X is such a tiny generation. When they were meant to be born, early 60s, contraceptive pill gets introduced. That keeps a lid on things. Halfway through, when they were meant to be born, early 70s, no-fault divorce gets introduced. No unhappy siblings get added. And then the 70s were a decade of unusually low migration intake. Forever a small generation. Now though, since they are in positions of powers, their values get amplified. These are the people that write policy. These are the people that set the strategic direction of organizations. These are the people that you want to influence. The good news is, I would argue that Gen X is a hyper-pragmatic generation. This is a generation that researches every feature of every leaf blower they purchase to death. So do not talk to them the same way that you talk to millennials or baby boomers, where you get away with moralistic, narrative-driven stuff. With Gen X, it's facts, it's feature, it's data. That stuff works with Gen X. And so that makes for a very pragmatic approach to leadership. They have two pet projects that they're pushing. One is gender equality. They were the first generation for moms to enter the world of work at scale. So it's the first bunch of people who thinks it's normal for women to be part of the workforce. So consider the gender pay gap completely closed by the end of this decade. There's no way in hell you get away with treating men and women any differently in a world that is run by Gen X and that will manage a workforce that is 75% millennial and Gen Z. So gender pay gap definitely closed by the end of the decade. Legal asterisks. This is the gender pay gap, not the gender income gap. The gender income gap is where we're not paying industries dominated by women any money. We're not fixing that. And had I told the story the other way around, I would have ended on a high, but I messed this up. So partially good news, I would say. But their policy direction in terms of gender equality under Gen X knows one direction and one direction only. The other pet project, and I'm outrageously optimistic about this, the other pet project that they have is work-life balance. They were called the latchkey generation because they came home to an empty house. They're the only generation that actually grew up essentially unsupervised. Their parents told them stuff like, just come back home when the streetlights turn on. Or don't, we don't really care. So that made them this pragmatic, self-reliant generation. And they will push work-life balance. They're really sensitive to this issue. It is the Gen X leaders of today that are pushing the idea of the four-day work week that you hear floated around all the time. And I am not also optimistic about that, to be honest. Because my big story is that we have a skills shortage, and the one thing that you do in a skills shortage is you work your existing staff to death. And so these are two competing narratives. Work your existing staff to death or give them heaps of spare time. I think the skills shortage will win out in the long run. So glass is half full, I guess, for Gen X. That's Gen X. The next generation down the track is the millennial generation, born in the 80s and 90s, and they are also called millennials. Yeah? Millennials, Gen Y, and why do we call them Gen Y? Because they always ask, why? Terrible joke. They are obsessed with meaning, obsessed with purpose, much more than any previous generation. They are the kids of the baby boomers. That means they grew up in households with materialistic security left, right, and center. They had it all growing up. And they were also never pushed by their parents to anything. Their parents, they never pushed them into a career. They said stuff like, I don't care what career you pursue. I just want you to be happy. And so millennials grow up, millennials find themselves finishing high school. The tyranny of choice is among them. What career should I study? What degree should I pursue? That hits them hard. And what do millennials do when they can't make a decision? They procrastinate. They take a gap year. And after this gap year, what do millennials do when they still can't make a decision? Well, they work overseas, they go on YouTube. They type in career advice. And they will hear the same narrative every single time. I was once stuck at a 9-to-5, working for the man, hamster wheel of work, hated every second of it. But then, one day, I looked deep inside my soul and I discovered my true meaning, my true purpose in life. And then, I created a startup. Sure, it was hard at first, but I doggedly, heroically persisted. Eventually I succeeded, and now I jump out of bed in the morning and I run to the office because I'm so excited to go to work. If I could do it, so can you. So this narrative, every single TED Talk, by the way, that I've ever seen, that is doing two things to our young Australians. The first one is rather nice. It leads to more young people having a go, creating a startup, trying to invent the way we work. That's cool, that's exciting. It might even lead to a couple of the big players taking their social corporate responsibility issues a bit more seriously. That's nice. But more than anything, this is leading to what I call work image issues. Work image issues are the office equivalent to body image issues, where we look at these sexy models and bodybuilders on Instagram, and then we look at ourselves and we go, could be better. And we literally have millions of young people sitting in cushiony 6-digit income jobs and think, there must be more to life than doing spreadsheets for NAP. And where does that obsession come from? That is new. Why is this all of a sudden that young people need to have a meaningful job? Why do we push this narrative on them? Their grandparents didn't have that problem. The meaning of life came from God for them. So that was easy to stomach a job at NAP, so to speak. But their baby boomer parents were already also a bit atheistic. And they also didn't suffer by working for NAP. But that's because they could focus on family. They made families in the early to mid-20s. Nowadays, young people have a hole, a meaning-shaped hole for about 2 decades after leaving high school, because if they start families at all, they only do so in their mid to late 30s. So is foster care potentially a solution? Is this a meaning-shaped narrative that could help with those young people? Yes, potentially you can improve marketing, messaging, campaigning, yes. But that's just one part. This narrative here is bigger. There are systemic issues in there. So let's explore a couple of those top carer personas in there. Empty nesters. Empty nesters are a top cohort because they have, experience potentially in care. They have a house full of crap that you need if you want to look after kids, and they have spare bedrooms, experience. That's pretty great. That is the number of people that live in. They're called family couples with no kids. So these are essentially couples without kids in the household. People start partnering up in their 20s. This is a decade ago. Then this number goes up, it goes down throughout the 30s as they actually add kids to their households. Then there are very precious few people in their 40s because you still have kids. Then the number goes up as your kids bit by bit leave the parental home. And then when you are in your 60s, that peaks. And then the number of households goes down because you die, or half of the household dies. So this is 2011. What happened over the last 10 years is, well, you have more people staying in their 20s and 30s in this couple stage of the life cycle for longer because you procrastinate with making babies. But that is not the cohort that you could focus on with empty nesters at all. Let's look at what is happening in the later stages of the life cycle. Well, there is growth, and there's much more growth coming here as the baby boomers will push into this healthy stage of retirement. That's a potential opportunity. If you get this messaging right, that is the only growth cohort for foster care that I see emerge. All the other cohorts are tightening quite significantly. And one of the tightening has to do with us pushing out parenthood. This is an age profile from the 1930s all the way to 2022. The age of birth, the age at birth of moms and dads. We only started recording the age of dads at birth in 75. So you see, then dads were 29 years of age. Now dads are 5 years older. Women even aged 6 years from 1975 onwards. That means, is there a narrative to push more foster care into people in their 20s, in their 30s, into people before they have kids themselves? Because childcare is, you see the trend, that is only going one way until we really hit a hard biological wall. We push it out that much. The fertility rate, number of kids per woman, goes down and down and down, is now on a record low. Yeah, so don't get confused when you hear about births, because we have close to record high births. So the midwives, they would not tell you stories of boredom and empty hospitals or whatever. They would tell you of stressed calendars. That's because we have now the biggest cohort that ever lived in Australia, millennials making babies. So even if we make babies at a super low rate, we still have a lot of babies. Yeah, so that's the connection there. But that's the slow life approach that I talked about earlier. It's a potential narrative to push, but I don't see this as a massive growth opportunity. I see people staying in the uncommitted, no responsibility stage of the life cycle for much longer, and it will be very hard to get a foothold into this market, so to speak. How about same-sex couples? Data about same-sex couples is a bit hard to get because the census doesn't ask, are you gay? It doesn't, but there is a thing called the same-sex indicator, same-sex couple indicator, because we ask, do you live with your partner? And we ask for your gender. And so if there are two adults two male adults in a household, they say they live with their partner, you're like, I think that might be a gay couple. And this is the age profile of same-sex couples, males and females thrown together, and you see that this peaks in the early 30s. That has to do with people becoming comfortable with this, and also this, we only look at de facto data, so we can compare homosexual couples with heterosexual couples. That's the reason for it. But it just means the younger you are, the more likely you are to openly live in a same-sex relationships. So that would say, then focus on the young cohorts. So relatively young same-sex couples. That is actually, that could be a growth narrative. This is we're looking at the age profile of couples, and we ask, are you a parent? Opposite sex couples, only de facto couples, you see that as they reach their 30s, they're more and more likely to become a parent. And then this goes down because the de facto couples stop being de facto couples because they do actually get married eventually. So that's the reason this goes down. So let's have a look at, let's say, female same-sex couples. They follow the exact same trajectory at a lower rate. So that is probably a much better cohort than male same-sex couples. Male same-sex couples tend to be a parent at a rate that is 7 times smaller than female same-sex couples. So if you want to reach the same-sex market and you have limited marketing dollar, throw it all at women. That has, a bigger chance of success, I would argue. Social service workers are, a great cohort of success, a big cohort of foster parents, foster carers. So let's have a look at the age profile there. 2011, a decade ago, the age profile, you have relatively few young carers and then relatively big chunk of people in the older market. Bizarrely enough, most jobs in Australia have gotten older. Not so social service workers. This is a profession that actually got younger. That's because we grew it from about 66,000 people to about 99,000 people in Victoria. So that is a big growth cohort, and we have a bunch of people in the young market. Wonderful opportunity. Could we get them into the pre-family formation stage? Yeah, that's a nice opportunity. Only one problem, they tend to not be showered with, mining style incomes. They tend to live in, they don't have many spare bedrooms. They tend to be living in financial stress to a certain degree. So that is not all that easy. But at least the base demographics are in your favor for this cohort. But am I outrageously optimistic? Sorry. So if we throw all of this together, and we talk about those hard criteria that you need to fulfill in order to be a foster carer, we can kind of estimate, the development of the market. It's great news. You need to be 81. You need to be at least 21 years of age. Will be more people. That's great news. But granted, lots and lots of this growth that we are seeing is actually in probably unutilizable cohorts. People in their 20s probably won't be foster carers at scale, so that's not useful growth. The growth that we see in the 80+ segment is useless for foster carers. So yes, there is more growth. That's kind of good news, but how much of this growth is actually, can we actually tap into? We don't know. You need to have a police check. We didn't really look at criminal data at scale here, but let's call this roughly even. Yeah, so that's not a major issue in Victoria, at least. The number of spare bedrooms, you do need to have a spare bedroom to be a foster parent. That is terrible, terrible, terrible news. Spare bedrooms are only available in the empty nester older cohort at scale. That is the only market segment with significant spare bedrooms. All the younger cohorts, that's a bit rough. And it's getting rougher because housing becomes more and more unaffordable. So that's not helping. Are you fit to care? This is the emotional, psychological stuff. Let's say we roughly stay as capable or incapable as we always have. So I'll give this, an equal sign. Enough time to foster. That is a clear, absolutely, things are getting worse. Dual income households are on the up and up and up. Households where people have more than one job, where one person has multiple jobs, that is on the up and up and up. That is terrible news. That is a significant tightening of the market. Hey, great news, fewer Australians smoke. That's a clear win. That is one of the great success stories, but in Australian healthcare history. But is this enough to tip the balance? Not at all. It can almost be ignored, to be honest. Financial stability, absolute catastrophic. We are now at a position where even dual income households, on skill level 1 workers struggle financially. Lots of the Gen X cohort, for example, they are burning the candle from 3 ends at the moment. I know it's a weird candle, but they still have financially dependent kids. They soon, because they're now in their 50s, they have financially dependent or care-dependent parents, and they are most likely to have upgraded their family home during the short respite of low interest rates, and they are now at the biggest risk of foreclosing on their mortgages. Not young mortgage holders, it is the upgraders that are most likely to foreclose, but that makes the banks nervous. So much stress in the system. That is not easy to handle. Fertility treatment, not necessarily a hard criteria, but if you look at this, the number of births that had a fertility treatment went from 2% in 2000 to over 5, close to 6% right now. So these are, of course, women who pay an arm and a leg for this treatment. This is not a cheap entertainment thing that you can do. Very expensive. That increases financial stress, emotional stress, probably less time to care, and so on. Even if it's not a high criteria, it definitely leads to a tightening of the care market. So many shocking news stories, but overall, the market tightens. The care pool tightens. That means, yes, potentially you can tweak your marketing. Yes, marketing dollars are always welcome, but it's not the solution. It is not an issue of get rid of the terrible marketing agency and get in the great marketing agency and finally everything is well. No, this is a systemic issue that needs systemic fixes. Systemic fixes are outrageously annoying and complex because they need deep-rooted change, and that is what we're needing.